Uh, Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending this webinar. It is a webinar that organized by the ADAI team from the University of Coimbra in the scope of Fire Risk Project. As you know, Fire Risk Project ended in April, but we continue to organize these webinars, and we are happy to have today this topic. And I thank very much Simone Martino, Kelly Jones, and Elsa Varela for having accepted our invitation to speak about this very important subject, very challenging of the let's say of the recovery of the burned areas and to give remuneration to the people that are let's say working in the forest areas. This is a very old subject, very old topic, and people speak about it often and often, but at least here in Portugal and in other countries in the world, we don't see much action, very many things concrete. I think it is necessary to have more research, more dialogue, more practice, and this webinar aims to that direction. I would like to thank my colleagues from ADAI team who organized the technical aspects of the event, and would like to ask all of you that are attending, as you know, you can use the question and answers place to put your questions. During the event, there will be at least 2 periods to reply to questions. And if you want to express your questions to the speakers, please address them and in a concrete way so that we will try to attend them. And if there is no time to reply to all, we will try to reply them later by writing. As you know, this webinar is being recorded. We will later make it available to those that could not attend it now in the YouTube so that this message can be broadcast to many more people who are interested in this topic. I will now give the floor to Simone Martino, who will introduce himself and the speakers, and he will manage the webinar. Thank you very much, Simone.
Thank you so much, Professor Viegas. My name is Simone Martino. I'm a researcher at the James Hutton Institute, Aberdeen, Scotland, in natural capital valuation. I just want to spend a couple of words to introduce the context and then the speakers, of course. And we know that there are several projects, including the project that you mentioned, the recently concluded Horizon 2020 Fire Risk project that you led with other colleagues. That have dealt with the concept of risk assessment, proposing integrated strategies for wildfire risk and risk management by developing a holistic science-based strategy that integrates fire prevention, suppression, and correct land use management practices. However, this analysis of fire risk management is often carried out considering the biophysical effectiveness of risk management strategies than the economic evaluation of strategies dealing with risk reduction. And today we have the chance to discuss how approaches to fire management can be valued in monetary terms and what policy changes in the management of fuel may be proposed and operationalized. So this current webinar focuses on the design and implementation of solutions aimed at reducing wildfire risk and providing a contribution from the angle of economic analysis. And we have the pleasure today to have 2 experienced researchers to discuss these issues. In the first talk, we are going to know about the importance of an innovative program implemented in Colorado called Payments for Watershed Services, designed to protect the multiple values at risk. And in the second talk, we're going to know about the possibility of implementing a payment for ecosystem services in Spain to compensate extensive graziers for their contribution to reducing fuel load. I remind you, as mentioned by Professor Viegas, that you may add questions in the Q&A box. And after each talk, we are going to have 10 minutes dedicated to your questions. Now it's time to introduce our speaker. Our first speaker is Kelly Jones, professor at New Mexico University and affiliated with the Forest Research Center. Kelly is trained in environmental economics. Her research focuses on understanding the anthropogenic drivers of land use change and biodiversity loss and measuring the impact of conservation and restoration actions on land cover change, ecosystem services, and human well-being. So the title of the presentation is Ecosystem Services and Return on Investment from Fuel Treatments Inside from Colorado. Kelly, you have 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for the invitation to present. Let me find the share button and I'll get my presentation loaded. Okay, are you seeing everything all right?
It's perfect, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for this invitation. It's my pleasure to be able to present some of my research on ecosystem services and return on investments from fuel treatment programs in Colorado. I completed this work a couple years ago when I was a professor at Colorado State University, and it was a large interdisciplinary project. So I'm an environmental economist by training, but this work was done in close collaboration with wildfire scientists and forest ecologists at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, which is also based at Colorado State University. I'm sure you're all aware of the wildfire crisis, which is why you've tuned into this webinar. The frequency, severity, and scale is increasing globally, and certain regions are more adversely affected. One of those is the Western United States. And this increase in severity and scale is driven in some part by past land management history, especially the suppression of fires over the last century in the Western United States. But it's being exacerbated by the changes in temperatures, drought, and hydrological volatility. And this is bringing large impacts to our ecosystems and our social and economic systems, including loss of life, loss of infrastructure, changes in ecosystems, and loss of ecosystem services. Some studies have put the cost of these impacts into 10 to 100 billions of US dollars per year for the United States. However, there are some known solutions to trying to reduce these catastrophic wildfires. And one is to increase the use of proactive fuel treatments like mechanical thinning or prescribed fire, as shown in the pictures on this slide. However, for the United States, if we were to address the scale at which we need to do these fuel treatments, we would need to do it on more than 20 million hectares. And if we were able to complete that work in 10 years, that would come at a financial cost of $5 to $6 billion per year. Unfortunately, we do not have the funding at hand to do that kind of scale of proactive fuel treatments. Historically, a lot of financing for fuel treatments has come from federal programs. And even with the budget we've had historically, they don't compensate or they don't address the full extent of hectares that need to be treated. And the future of those funding sources is uncertain. And so in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been an increase in innovative financing mechanisms to try and scale up fuel treatments in the United States. One of those governance mechanisms is payments for ecosystem services, where the general definition is that the beneficiaries of payments are investing money to land managers who then make a specific natural resource action, and that payment is conditional on them completing that natural resource action. One of the common funders of these PES-like approaches in the wildfire space are water utilities. And that's because about 70% of people in the Western United States depend on forested watersheds for their drinking water. So there's a clear beneficiary for doing these fuel treatment work. But besides water utilities, we could also think about carbon offset programs or insurance companies as potential beneficiaries of fuel treatment approaches. Other innovative governance or financing approaches include things like environmental impact bonds, where we're seeing private investment money being used to fund fuel treatments, and then these private investors are being paid back after it's completed based on performance outcomes. And we've also seen local initiatives where counties or states have raised their sales taxes to help directly fund fuel treatment work. The approach I'm going to be focused on today is this PES-like approach with water utilities, but I just wanted to make you aware that there's several of these innovative financing mechanisms starting to take place in the United States. Now, with this increase in non-federal financing for field treatments, there's also questions about accountability and making sure the outcomes that these investors are hoping to see are actually occurring on the landscape, which requires different types of evaluation. And doing these evaluations can not only say whether or not those outcomes that they want to see are happening, it can also help inform where they should be investing their money and how much to invest in terms of fuel treatments. And so that really led to the objectives of the study I'm going to present today. We were actually approached at Colorado State University by Denver Water Utility and the U.S. Forest Service to do an economic assessment, specifically a benefit cost analysis of a program called From Forest to Faucets Partnership. And this program started in Colorado in 2011. It's a PES-like approach because both organizations, the water utility and the Forest Service, are combining funding to pay for proactive fuel treatments on the landscape. Now, Denver Water supplies all of the water for Denver, Colorado, and surrounding suburbs. It's a population of over 1.5 million people, and they were hit by catastrophic wildfires in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where they spent over $30 billion to clean up some of the erosion, sedimentation, debris flow that occurred after those fires. And this really led them to think about how could they be more proactive in the watersheds around Denver that supplied the drinking water for their consumers. So that led to the start of this PES program in 2011. The fuel treatments are actually implemented on public lands. And so it is the public lands that are getting the proactive fuel treatments because a lot of the watersheds around Denver are on national forest and state lands. And the targeted benefit is that source water protection, right? Because the water utility is really initiating this type of PES approach. But Denver Water and the U.S. Forest Service also have many other environmental and community objectives that they would like to achieve with this PES program. So we set out to do this evaluation, and I'll talk a little bit about our study area and how we defined it and the methods we used to do this benefit cost analysis now. So the blob you see here in this figure is the whole water collection system for Denver Water. And this black line is kind of the extent. It's about 1.5 million hectares. We just have an 8-kilometer buffer around that extent for our geospatial analysis. And you can see in blue here that these are the surface water bodies. So a lot of the water is in reservoirs, and then you can see the streams. And within this boundary, you see that there are 3 national forests that show up in different shades of green, and they make up more than 60% of this water collection system or our study area. And the zones of concern are these pink or purple polygons. And what they refer to are these are areas that Denver Water had previously prioritized before they started this PES-like program in 2011, because they had done an assessment with some hydrologists to identify, where are the areas that contribute most to their water supply. So they already had this kind of prioritization done previous to the PES program. And so I'll be talking about these zones of concern a little bit later in the presentation. So I just want to point out those boundaries. And for this economic assessment, we collected data on about 25,000 hectares of fuel treatments that have been completed by the PES program between the years 2011 and 2019. And you can see here in red and this orange color, kind of the 2 different databases where we were able to get information on fuel treatments. And they include a mix of mechanical thinning, prescribed fire, previous wildfires that were allowed to burn, and then clear cutting. So what we did is we adopted a risk assessment framework for our analysis, where we consider fire an uncertain event made up of 2 activities. We have wildfire likelihood, or the probability that a wildfire is going to occur. And then we have, if that wildfire occurs, the consequences or the intensity of that wildfire. And so within this wildfire risk framework, we focused on the fact that fuel mitigation treatments were expected to affect changes in fire behavior only. So this wildfire intensity, holding the likelihood of wildfire constant in our models. And because this is an uncertain process, we developed 4 different scenarios to capture different assumptions about wildfire likelihood and wildfire intensity. And we compared each of those scenarios to a counterfactual of no fuel treatments on the landscape. Now, I'm not going to go through these different scenarios in detail, but I just want to point out that they range from kind of the most optimistic scenario, scenario 1, where we assume that all fuel treatments on the landscape encounter fire, and that if a fuel treatment encounters fire, it lowers the severity of that fire by 1 level, to the most conservative scenario, scenario 4, where we use wildfire models to predict where we think wildfire is going to occur on the landscape. And so that determines whether fuel treatments encounter wildfire. And we also use a model to adjust the wildfire behavior intensity based on the type of fuel treatment used. So prescribed fire versus mechanical thinning versus clear cut have different proportional adjustment factors for how much fire intensity changes. With that risk assessment framework, we link it to a set of ecosystem service and societal benefits that are expected to occur due to the fuel treatments. In the economic literature, we refer to the ones that we're quantifying as avoided costs. And this table shows the full list of values at risk that might be avoided by putting fuel treatments on this landscape. And we came up with this list by having discussion group meetings with both Denver water personnel and Forest Service personnel involved in this PES program. And so, as I mentioned, source water protection is the target goal of the program. And they identified many different potential values at risk around source water protection, from reservoir protection to water quality protection. But they also identified some community environmental co-benefits that they cared about as part of this PES program and that they hope to mitigate. And those include things like protecting private homes, avoiding the cost of post-fire recovery and rehabilitation like reforestation or sediment control, to recreation and carbon storage and sequestration. The values at risk in bold were the ones that through our project, we were actually able to quantify. And the few that are not in bold, like public health impacts, timber, we were not able to include in our analysis. Now, each of those values at risk are linked to our wildfire risk assessment framework. The source water protection values were linked through process-based models. And then those co-benefits were mostly linked by looking at the change in hectares that would be at high severity fire versus lower severity fire due to having fuel treatments on the landscape. In this presentation, I'm not going to be able to go through all the details of the types of data and the modeling we did for all those values at risk, but I will point you to the full paper and report at the end of my presentation. I just want to highlight that for the source water protection values, we used established biophysical models to understand how hill slope erosion would be impacted by fuel treatments and how debris flow would be impacted, and those are listed here in the table. And then to get the economic values for source water protection, we collected primary data, again, from Denver Water and the Forest Service. By having these discussion groups, we had them rank the relative importance of all the water utility infrastructure in our study area. And we gathered information from them on past expenditures for recovering after wildfires. As I mentioned, there had been these catastrophic fires already in this study area. And so we were able to actually get how much they spent on cleaning up erosion and debris flow. And that is what we use to get our economic values. For many of those environmental and community co-benefits, we had to rely on secondary data. And so we used different established models in the literature, or again, we looked at just the change in hectares that would go from high severity to lower severity fire due to fuel treatments for our biophysical data. And then for our economic valuation, we went to the literature. So we did kind of a transfer of values by looking at similar studies that have done an economic valuation, or we got secondary data from places like housing prices to look at changes in non-water infrastructure. So again, those details are laid out in the paper and the report I'll point you to. Once we collected all of these data on the benefits, we'd done our 4 scenarios in our wildfire risk assessment modeling, and we collected data on costs, we were then able to do this benefit cost analysis or assessment. For the economic benefits of fuel treatments, we spread these over a 25-year time period, and that was based on a recent study in Colorado that showed that these fuel treatments like mechanical thinning and prescribed fire have a upper lifetime of about 25 years before they need to be repeated. For the fuel treatment costs, we spread them over the 9 years of the program in which we collected data. And then all these dollars were put into the baseline of 2011, and we used a 3% discount rate. And then we did this benefit cost ratio, and you can see in blue here that formula. So we summed all the benefits and all the costs. And then we got this ratio where a value of 1 or greater implies a positive return on investment of this PES program. We did this assessment for the full study area, so that large kind of blob of a polygon I showed you, which is about 1.5 million hectares. And then we also did it specifically for those zones of concern. So those pink or purple polygons I showed you, which represent an area that already been prioritized for source water protection. We ran the same analysis just for those areas. And then we also include a sensitivity analysis because we know that we probably have some uncertainty, especially in our economic benefit calculations. We're missing some values like public health, carbon storage. And so we increase the values of the benefits in this benefit cost analysis to see kind of what the sensitivity was to those changes. So I'm going to turn now to the results and what we found. I'm just going to present kind of very simple figures here. And we have on the left the full study area, so that 1.5 million hectares, and on the right, those purple or pink polygons, the zones of concern. And again, the 1 is kind of the threshold for the benefit cost ratio. Anything above that implies a positive return on investment. Anything below that implies that you don't have a positive return on investment. And we have our 4 wildfire scenarios where, again, 1 is most optimistic, 4 is most conservative. And so what you see is that for those more optimistic scenarios where the impact of fuel treatments occur because it's conditional on fire occurrence, so we're assuming that all fuel treatments encounter a wildfire in those 25 years, we do have a positive return on investment for scenario 1 and 2 when we include the co-benefits in our full study area. So we don't see it for the just blue bar graph when we only look at source water protection, but when we add in those environmental community co-benefits in green, we do get a positive return on investment. For the zones of concern only, we do find that you get a positive return on investment just for source water protection in the most optimistic scenario, but not in scenario 2. Now, we never see, of course, a positive return on investment in scenarios 3 and 4, which are the more conservative, and that's that expected fire occurrence. So we actually modeled the probability that the fuel treatments encounter fire over those 25 years. So that was kind of our key takeaway. We did do that sensitivity analysis where we account for the fact that we do have some missing economic values in our benefit cost assessment. And what we find is that the economic benefits would need to be 3 times greater than what we include in our initial calculations to get a positive return on investment across all scenarios. And specifically what we find here is that with the source water protection only, the blue bar graph, we get a positive return on investment for scenarios 1 and 2. And then for scenarios 3 and 4, you need to add in those co-benefits still to get that positive return on investment of this PES program. All right, let me try and break down what that means and what the implications are for this study area and also more broadly for economic assessments of PES programs. So we can ask the question, this is the question, the Denver Water and the Forest Service approached us with, is this PES program worth it, right? Is it having that positive return on investment that the investors wanted to have? And we can answer that by saying it really depends. It depends on the assumptions we make in our modeling framework. It depends on whether we captured all the economic benefits of fuel treatments in our framework, and it depends on your risk tolerance. So what we found here in point 1 is that the benefit cost ratio is positive, conditional on fire occurring where fuel treatments were implemented. So if a fire happens where you have a fuel treatment, it works. Now, the challenge with these PS programs is that wildfire events are still relatively rare, and it's unlikely that everywhere fuel treatment is made is going to encounter a wildfire in that 25-year time span. However, if it does, the consequences can be devastating for a water utility. And so if you have a low risk tolerance, which a lot of water utilities do, then it makes sense to invest proactively in these fuel treatments. The second key finding or conclusion is that this benefit cost ratio is more likely to be positive if you include both the source water protection benefits and those other environmental and community co-benefits. Now, this is a finding that's been shown in other studies as well. There was a study in California that showed that for just source water protection, you don't get a positive return on investment for these PES programs, but if you include the co-benefits, you do. It's exactly what we found here in Colorado. And for PS programs, the implication is that, you may need to bring or think about multiple investors or beneficiaries of these fuel treatments to fund this type of work. In water utilities coupled with, say, carbon offset programs or other types of beneficiaries. Luckily, Denver Water has a broad portfolio of interests. As I mentioned, they are interested in other environmental and community co-benefits other than just source water protection. A third key finding is that the benefit cost ratio, that return on investment, is higher when areas are already targeted explicitly for source water protection or the value at risk that the PS program is focused on. So that was those zones of concern and how we found a higher return on investment, and we're more likely to find a positive return on investment for those zones of concern areas. And this makes sense and has been found more broadly in the PES literature that spatial targeting is important. So whether you're targeting source water protection or carbon storage or biodiversity, if you can already identify that area, that is where you should be doing your action. And then lastly, we find that the economic benefits would need to be at least 3 times greater than what we estimated in our study to have a positive return on investment across all 4 of our scenarios, or our wildfire scenarios. And we believe that this is likely the case. We did our initial economic evaluation, but we know there was uncertainty in the values we included because we had to use the secondary literature and secondary studies for many of our co-benefits. And we know we excluded many important economic benefits, for example, the public health benefits. We can also, and we also do in our report and our papers, talk about how this PS program could be improved in terms of efficiency. A couple key recommendations is that accounting for biophysical processes and where the treatments are made would lead to a return on investment. We found that 1/3 of the treatments were made in lower severity areas, so the burn probability was quite low. We also found that about 60% of treatments were made outside of those zones of concern or priority areas for source water protection. So we're able to provide recommendations for this PS program on how to improve efficiency. We also found that very few prescribed fire treatments were made in the landscape, only about 22%. And so we recommended that they try and increase that because it has a higher impact on reducing fire behavior than some of the other fuel treatments like mechanical thinning alone. We also recommended they try and treat more hectares. Only 2% of the total study area was actually treated in this PS program up to 2019. And so that was another recommendation. And then I'll just kind of wrap up with some broader implications for these economic assessments, these benefit cost analyses or return on investment studies for wildfire risk reduction programs. Some of the things we learned by doing this for the Colorado case study is that the models, the wildfire models, really need to reflect the latest science on wildfire likelihood and wildfire intensity. We felt they were probably underestimated in the models we used, and that's because we have been observing fires in the Western US occurring at higher elevations and in different forest types than historically have occurred, and they're not quite reflected yet in some of our wildfire models. So that is one recommendation as we move forward with these types of assessments. A second recommendation is that we need to make sure programs, PS programs, other fuel treatment programs, are doing better spatial accounting of where they're doing these forest management actions. And that includes both before and after the fuel treatment if possible. So we really spent a lot of time trying to put that database together of where fuel treatments had occurred due to this PES program. There wasn't good accounting, and we didn't have good data on the per acre cost for different fuel treatment types. So there has been an effort, there is an effort being made now by the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, who I worked on with this study, and similar organizations to do this for the whole, for most of the Western United States, to actually gather data on all the fuel treatments that have ever been made so that we can do a better assessment of the effectiveness of fuel treatments and where to target them in the future. And then finally, if you are going to embark on one of these assessments of the economic benefits of forest restoration or fuel treatments, we need to make sure we're starting with a framework that identifies all the benefits of forest restoration that could be important to stakeholders. There was a paper published in 2024 that I think lays out a really nice framework for these ecosystem service benefits and other types of associated benefits. You can see the citation here in Figure 1 includes those avoided costs like we included in our study, but also some enhanced initial ecosystem services. So this would be a good framework if you're hoping to do a similar type of study in your area where you work. And then I'll just put up this last slide if you want to take a screenshot if you are interested in getting more information about our study and about our modeling and our economic valuation. Our journal article was published in 2022 in Forest Policy and Economics. And if you can't get a copy yourself, feel free to email me and I can send you or share a copy with you directly. The full report has a lot more detail on the methods and the assumptions, and that is free for anyone. You can go to that web link and get the PDF. And then one of my co-authors and colleagues actually talked about our study in a podcast for Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. And so if you want to listen to someone else talk about this study, you can look up that podcast and listen to it. So thank you so much. I appreciate your listening and we're happy to try and answer your questions.
Many thanks, Kelly. Perfect timing. Thank you so much. It was a very interesting talk. In particular, I think these type of schemes of payment for ecosystem services are quite new in Europe. And personally, I don't know if there is any similar approach developed here. Personally, I'm not a person extremely deeply involved in the fire. I mean, I've been also in this project and that I mentioned at the beginning, the Fire Jurist project led by Professor Viegas, but I don't know much. We can hear about later about this aspect in Europe from the second speaker. I propose a couple of questions from the audience. So one is about, I don't know if it's a more general, it's directly to you. Is there any discussion of the value of emergency warning for all, which is a program, I think, of the UNDRR? Probably, I don't know if the question is directed to us as a proponent of this talk, or it's just a question to you in the sense if these activities is linked somehow to any international project or program, such as this one, the Emergency Warning for All, which is promoted by the United Nations.
I don't know about that program specifically. I will say that the water utility, Denver Water, that is not linked to any kind of international or even national initiative. It really was a local initiative based on kind of having gone through those catastrophic wildfires, working with the Forest Service. There are a lot of programs in the United States where the Forest Service is working to collaborate with other land managers. And so it's not unique though. So the Denver, Colorado PES program with the water utility, there's a similar program in New Mexico called the Rio Grande Water Fund. And so some of you may have heard the term water fund. The Nature Conservancy has been a big proponent of those types of programs globally. And so there's been some water funds specifically for wildfire risk reduction developed in the United States. The Nature Conservancy is a partner of that. And so they're kind of one-off initiatives, usually around a big, urban city with a lot of water consumers with, mountainous watersheds upstream. And but there hasn't been kind of a national or international kind of program that's really led to them. They've kind of just, it's a little bit more organically created in each case.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. If there is time, I come back to the program overall, but I want to, before, ask questions from our audience. So the second question is about rewilding. The question is, would rewilding or introducing grazers reduce your cost on reducing fire risk in this area? Or are there any other reasons to not consider this?
I think that's a great question, and I'm looking forward to learning more about using grazers in the next presentation. It's not something that in the Denver water area they're using in those Forest Service lands. We do have grazing in forest, national forests in the U.S. in certain cases, but in that area, it's much more used for recreation, for hiking, for camping, skiing, and so it's managed much more as a recreation area. But I have heard that they're starting to use grazers for reducing fuel risk, or sorry, wildfire risk in New Mexico, where historically there's been a lot more grazing on national forests, especially from sheep and cattle. And so I'm really interested in learning more as well. And I do think it could be a good strategy. And of course, we want to look at the cost effectiveness. We need to gather some data on that to actually measure it in a similar framework which we did for this mechanical thinning and prescribed fire work.
Okay, thanks. There is another question which is technical and is related to fuel treatment area. So the question is, I want to learn how fuel treatment areas were determined in your study area. What proportion of fuel was considered for treatment?
That's a good question, and there may be more details in the report that you could find. From my memory, so the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, does have databases or has some databases on fuel treatments that have been made. So we mostly relied on those, and they provided those spatial polygons. And then we used remote sensing data to look at the vegetative cover before and after the fuel treatments were made. And that's how we had to determine effectiveness, if you will, in the scenarios where we modeled whether or not we thought the vegetation was impacted. As I mentioned, in two of our scenarios, we just assumed that the manager knew what they were doing. And if they put a fuel treatment, they lowered the fire intensity or behavior. And so we had to kind of do that because we didn't have good accounting data on the type of work done at the landscape level and how that fuel treatment actually was implemented. So that was, again, one of our recommendations, is that we need to have better information on that. People need to, account for what was actually done on the landscape. And then, of course, that remote sensing data can be really helpful to look at the before and after the fuel treatment was implemented.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thanks for your answer. There is a comment more than a question from Rashid, who said that he worked on adaptation options for wildfire management in Europe, with particular focus on using fire models to evaluate whether investment in suppression and prevention can reduce burden area. So, okay, he says that he would like to have appreciate the opportunity to share some ideas, but he has not proposed any question. Rashid, if you have any questions later, because you work in Europe, after you hear our second speaker that is going to talk about an interesting case studies in Europe, feel free to ask questions, I would say. Another questions from Alfred again. In how far you think that this monetary approach threatens the moral approach of good stewardship? This is quite interesting question.
Can you, repeat the last part?
Sorry. In how far you think that this monetary approach threatens the moral approach of good stewardship?
Threatens the model?
Threatens the moral approach of
the moral approach. No, I mean, I think we need to have information for multiple reasons in terms of monitoring and evaluation. And with this return on investment study we did, it was specifically requested by the water utility, mainly because they have a board of directors and they had to show, right, that there was an outcome for their investments. And I didn't mention, but they were kind of evaluating the 10-year mark of the program. And with our study, they were able to get money to continue the program, and it's still functioning today. They're still doing this PS approach. Now, I don't think we always need to monetize those benefits, but I think some type of monitoring is important. One, because we want to make sure we have limited resources financially and on the labor side, especially here in the US, that's been a challenge. So we want to make sure what we're doing is working. And we can learn a lot about where we should be doing these field treatments with these assessments. And that's going to be really important so that we're using our money wisely and we're using all those other resources wisely. So I think there needs to be some type of monitoring and evaluation. I don't think it always needs to be a monetization of the benefits, but some other type of risk assessment framework or measure of values at risk can really help improve the effectiveness of these fuel treatment programs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for your clear answer. I think we have 3 minutes more, 3 minutes. There are no other questions from my side. Moving back to one of the initial presentation, which was about the explanation of this program that is funded by the Denver Water Utility and the USDA Forest Service. So some of the benefits are for many public uses of water, because you can improve investing in this program, you can improve the quality of water. Is there any effect on the bill that people pay? I mean, there was presumably part of this cost is funded increasing the charge, the water charge, I don't know how to call it properly. Has this, as far as you know, generated any negative impact on people?
Yeah, I don't know if it's been studied, if people even know they're paying in their bill a certain amount for this program. But yes, Denver Water Utility did add in, a small, you have a lot of consumers, 1.5 million, but so they added in a small price increase that does help fund this program and other kind of forest restoration work in the watersheds. I don't know of any study that's looked at how consumers feel about that downstream or if they even know that that's happening in the bill. Some of these other payment for watershed services programs, the similar programs, don't pass it on to the consumer. They use other, funding sources from within their utility or grants or loans to do it. So there are different financing mechanisms being used. But I know in the Denver Water case, they are collecting it from the consumers themselves. So, that's a question and can become an equity question in some places. Having lived in Colorado previous to where I live now for 10 years, I think there is a lot of support for forest restoration and management. And, my anecdotal conclusion would be that most people would be pretty supportive, having seen the impacts of catastrophic wildfire, of, paying for this protection of their watersheds.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I checked the chat. I don't see any new questions. So probably I'm happy to open the floor to our organizers. I wonder if Tiago or Domingos or even Elsa, our second speaker, if you have any specific questions from your point of view, or maybe you can do later. Let me check if there is any further curiosity.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for your very interesting presentation. This interest from the water companies is very relevant. We can see that also in Portugal and in Europe, I believe. But the program that you presented is very comprehensive. So far, I've seen several research projects looking at the impact of fires on the watersheds and what what can be let's say the negative aspects. But you presented some actions to encourage people to reduce the wildfire risk and to reduce these impacts. And I think the approach that you made on calculating the costs of both the actions and the benefits, it's very important because in the end, we think we have to consider the monetary aspect of the problem. Otherwise, when you come to the landowner, you come to the person that has to make some investment in these operations. If you don't show them that there is a benefit from that, I think we'll never manage to convince them to have. It's very, very good that we emphasize the relevance of wildfire protection and its impact on the watershed, because water is a utility that we, of course, we value very much, and we find that it is precious and it may be diminishing, and if we don't treat it carefully, it may be problems. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we've definitely found that water is something that everyone can agree is important. And I think more and more the science shows that these catastrophic wildfires are having real impacts, right, to our watersheds and water quality, water quantity. Flooding's become a big issue in the Western United States as well. And so I think the more we can communicate that from the local community up to water utilities and decision makers, the more I think engagement there will be and understanding of the need to do this work for those water beneficiaries as well.
Thank you. We have the final quick one for you. Maybe this is quick. Anna asked, did you take into account any potential negative effects from the interventions, such as adverse health impacts from the prescribed burn treatments?
No, it's a great question. And it's something I think if you're doing this assessment, you certainly need to think about. We did not account for that specifically in our assessment. But we did talk about, right, and some of the challenges of quantifying things like carbon storage and sequestration benefits of having a wildfire versus doing fuel treatments where you're reducing the amount of trees. The science on that, there's still a lot of discussion about how to quantify that correctly. And so one of the reasons we didn't get into it in our study is we didn't feel like we had the right expertise. So I do think, it's not as simple as everything's positive, everything's negative. I think that, having an interdisciplinary team of scientists who really understand the different ecosystem services you care about is important, and having those conversations. And even if you can't quantify, being able to discuss like this might be negative or positive, to really lay out the assumptions of your accounting framework is important. So it's a good question and a good thing to consider, but we did not explicitly consider it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kelly, for your contribution. We really appreciate. We are on time, but it's time also to move on to the second speaker, Elsa Varela.
Excuse me.
Yes.
If you allow me, I would like to remind the attendants, if you want to ask questions, please put them in the question and answer, because I see some of you are using the chat conversation to put questions.
Perfect, thanks.
The question and answer would be better. Okay.
Many thanks. I didn't take attention that some people were using the chat instead of the Q&A box. Please feel free to move your questions to the Q&A box, and then we can, at the very end of this, before the end of this webinar, we may come back to some of the questions that have not been answered. So it's time now to present the second speaker, Elsa Varela, Associate Research Professor at the Institute of Public Goods and Policies, CSIC Spain. Her work focuses on promoting sustainable wildfire resilience landscapes through biodiversity conservation and ecosystem service provision. She applies economic evaluation and behavioral science using a multi-method approach, including surveys, interviews, expert panels, deliberative methods to address land abandonment, forest expansion, wildfire impacts from a socio-ecological perspective. Title of the presentation is Targeted Grazing and Landscape Management for Wildfire Resilience in the Mediterranean. Elsa, 20 minutes for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Simone. Let me share my presentation.
Sure.
Okay, so I think you should be able to see it now. Yes. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see your presentation. It's not yet in full presentation mode, but
should be now. Can you see it?
Now I can see it in full presentation mode. Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you, Simone, and thank you to the organizers for this invite. I'm really happy to be here today. So today I'll be talking about targeted grazing and how this can be a very strategic tool to promote wildfire resilience in Mediterranean landscapes. And I'll walk you through a couple of initiatives in 2 different regions in Spain that use targeted grazing. And I will also talk about research findings on how farmers perceive these type of payments for grazing activities. So let me now start with considering the broader picture in Europe. I bring you back to Europe now. And we know that 5 of the countries in Europe already account for most of the burnt area annually. And we know that in these countries, we have improved wildfire suppression, such as in the case of Spain, and this allowed us to reduce the burnt area from the high impact of wildfires in the in the decade of the 80s and early 90s. And importantly, this has allowed us also to protect forest ecosystems and the wild and urban interface. However, we know that this extinguishing technology can only contain a small fraction of the potential of fires. And as Kelly mentioned before, we need to be more proactive and address the management of the vegetation. So in this respect, we can we generally distinguish between direct and indirect wildfire risk mitigation strategies. And with respect to the latter, we know that we have increasing evidence rather that these actions that combine fire resilient forests intermingle with patches of farming or agro-silvopastoral land uses are producing more resilient landscapes for wildfire. And if we move now to direct wildfire risk mitigation measures, these are usually focused on actions that take place either in fire breaks or in wild and urban interfaces. And these activities that manage to reduce biomass are usually undertaken with heavy and low machinery, and more recently using prescribed burning. However, we know that this type of management is quite scarce also in many parts of the Mediterranean, and this is similar to what Kelly presented, mainly because this type of actions lack of economic sustainability, and this hinders reaching a critical mass that would help us modifying the flammability of the landscape. And it is in this situation when targeted grazing plays a role or comes into the scene, because it will help us to reduce biomass and in that way reduce the need of mechanical intervention, saving some costs, usually for the public administration. And I would like now to present you a couple of initiatives, as I mentioned, that use this targeted grazing for wild risk mitigation purposes. The first of them is located in southern Spain, in Andalusia, and this is a program that has been running since 2005, financed by the public administration within the budget of the Fire Prevention and Extinction Service. And this program remunerates local shepherds for these biomass reduction services that they provide in fire breaks in public forests. And the payments are modulated according to the difficulty of grazing and also according to the degree of compliance. The program started in the early 2000s as a research project, and then it extended throughout the region. And the numbers are still quite stable, with more than 200 shepherds and 6,000 hectares of fuel breaks that are maintained with targeted grazing. Together with some colleagues in 2018, we analyzed this program, which operates the ROPCA program as a PIS scheme. It's a program that is where payment is conditional on performance, and where the additionality, the services are additional to what we would get in comparison with a non-PIS program intervention. So the shepherds are providing a service that they wouldn't provide otherwise in these areas, unless if the payment were not here. This is the way that the payments are calculated. This is a formula employed, and the shepherds are asked to consume in these areas, in these fire breaks, every year, almost all the herbaceous vegetation, 90% of that herbaceous vegetation growth, and 75% of the growth of the shrubby vegetation. The payments range between 42 and 90 euros per hectare, and how this is modulated, or the range is modulated according to the grazing difficulty, as you can see there, based on the distance to the farmstead, the slope, that's the P coefficient, and the type of vegetation. And of course, the accomplishment is measured both per the different areas entrusted, and also there is an assessment of the global accomplishment that is aiming, or that is trying to get from the shepherds a very homogeneous accomplishment across all the entrusted areas. In the analysis that we performed, we saw that the shepherds are assigned on average 38 hectares of fuel breaks, that the payments range between 35 and 70 euros per hectare. And there you can see also the average unit costs of this program, which in total The total cost estimates are roughly 1% of the budget for wildfire prevention in the region. We also undertook a rough estimate of what would be the costs and benefits of the program compared to a mechanical clearing only scenario. And in there, I can provide more details later, and also on the paper that we published, which is public access. But what we saw is that the cost of our program, considering the saving or the avoided costs of mechanical means by the shepherds, together with the payment scheme, in the best scenarios would save up to 1,000 euros per hectare to the public administration. And this program has been somehow replicated or adapted to the local conditions in another region in Spain, in Catalonia, where I'm living. And in this case, the program is funded by the Common Agricultural Policy, the second pillar of the Common Agricultural Policy, that is the Rural Development Program. And within this, we have some funds for sustainable forest management that are paying for this program. The eligible areas where the shepherds develop their activity are within what is called priority protection perimeters, which are found in this map in this orange color. And these areas are designated by firefighters as key areas because they've been suffering recurrent wildfires. And within those, there are some strategic areas that are very key for the firefighters because these are safe areas where they can access and from where they can contain and suppress fires. So they need these areas to be very having a very low biomass content, and it is in these areas where shepherds develop their activity. And of course, these areas are previously treated through mechanical browsing or control burning, so they can develop their activity of controlling biomass more effectively. Here, similarly to the RAPCA program in Andalusia that we saw before, the payments are also modulated, and there is a performance supervision and monitoring to certify compliance. As you can see, the payments in these very strategic areas are higher. That's 140 euros per hectare compared to the 90, which is the upper threshold of the payments in Andalusia. And as you can see also in this slide, the region is really politically advocating for this program. So in the last year, as you can see, they've doubled the number of shepherds. They've increased the area entrusted to them. And importantly, the contracts that were previously yearly signed are now 4-year contracts with the shepherds. And now I will move to the last part of my presentation, where I would like to show you some results of a study we conducted for understanding whether farmers are willing to, or what are the reasons that would motivate farmers to participate in targeted grazing payment schemes. Maybe some of you may think that it would be just a matter of paying. So if we pay more money to them and the payments are more generous, desirably we will have more people, more farmers participating. But we know that beyond these crude financial reasons, there are other factors that influence participation, such as environmental attitudes of the farmers, whether the scheme is aligned with their own values, also whether the compensation level considers not only the loss of income linked to targeted grazing, but also the associated costs of transforming, of changing the way they manage their animals to provide this service. And also another very important issue is the flexibility of the design and whether it has low associated costs for this transformation, for this adaptation of the farming style. And for this objective, to understand their willingness to participate in these schemes, and this was a research conducted within a national funded project, we adopted a deliberative monetary evaluation approach because we wanted to understand what drives their participation. So we combined a discrete choice experiment survey with a structured group deliberation. And we conducted this survey in 2 different regions, in Catalonia, in the provinces of Barcelona and Girona, and in the province of Huesca, in the neighboring region of Aragon. We conducted a total of 4 workshops with 43 farmers. And how we designed this study, since we wanted to check the impact of deliberation, we gave them a discrete choice experiment survey in the beginning of the session that each of them filled in individually. Then we went into the deliberation about the programs of targeted grazing and issues related with this activity. And then we conducted a post-deliberation discrete choice experiment to test the impact of the deliberation on their preferences. The discrete choice experiment, what we showed to them in this individual survey were what we call choice cards, as this one that you can see in the image. And these cards have, as you can see, two different options, which represent different targeted grazing programs, and an opt-out option, which is the third column. So each of these options show different types of targeted grazing programs, payment programs, with different what we call attributes or different features that vary in their levels. In option A, for example, the farmers would get the advice of a technician. The monitoring can be done either by farmers or technicians, depending on the option A or B. The length of the contract also varied from 1 year to 20 years in the different choice cards. We also offer in some of the options the possibility of having a bonus, an extra payment of 80 euros per hectare if they had an homogeneous high accomplishment in all the areas entrusted to them. And finally, we had a payment level ranging from 90 to 180 euros hectare, considering different levels. I have a couple of slides also on discrete choice experiments, because maybe some of you are not familiar with this economic valuation method, but it's a survey method that will help us to understand which features, which attributes of these programs people value and how we can compensate them if we want them to participate in a program. So basically, in that equation that you see there, that's the utility or the satisfaction that they get by participating in the program, and that depends on the combination of these different attributes that compose each of the programs. So what we measure, what we estimate with econometric models is the beta parameter. That is we measure the intensity of the preferences for the different attributes that compose these different programs. And what we do is estimating these preferences through maximum likelihood procedures and probabilistic models. And importantly, what we can calculate are the implicit price estimates, which is the last equation that you see in the image. So there, for example, we can calculate how much we have to pay them in a program that counts with the advice of a technician, how much we have to compensate them or pay to the farmer to participate in a program that counts on advice, by dividing the beta parameters of the advice attribute by the beta parameter of the payment. So let me now move to some of the results, starting with the deliberative session. And one of our main findings was that there were contrasting views on how farming and targeted grazing are considered or seen by the farmers. Some of them, at one end of the spectrum, were those farmers, typically older and more traditional farmers, that would see wildfire prevention as a co-benefit of a thriving farming activity. So they would provide that service for free if they have good conditions to develop their activity. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we found generally younger farmers that were more, had this idea of extensive grazing as a way of providing, or targeted grazing as a way of providing a service. So they would be service providers that they were willing to sacrifice their productive activity to be a service provider and be paid for that. And within these two spectrums, extreme of the spectrum, we had a lot of gray zones and gray preferences. With respect to the attributes that we show them, in terms of the advice attribute, what we saw is a lot of skepticism amongst them, because they were not really trusty on the administration providing someone that would support them, encourage them, and being on their side. So this is a big thing that should be addressed by the policymakers. In terms of the length of the contract, most of them preferred medium to long-term contracts, also because that would provide them the opportunity to adapt their business management to provide this service. And of course, they signal the necessity to have an opt-out option and being able to leave the program if they're not happy with it. In terms of monitoring, it was very clear which were the trade-offs that they may face. On the one hand, if they undertake the monitoring, it would be a way of show and improve accountability and reporting their performance, but that would increase their workload. And the bonus, in many cases, clash with their interest, and they would see the bonus as a way of not being considerate with the welfare of their animals. So if they're not accomplishing at the highest level, it's not because they don't want to, it's because that will compromise the health of their animals, some of them said. In the case of the payment, what they said is some of them were willing to get a lower payment per hectare, provided that they get more hectares entrusted, and that would make a significant share of their income. So there were some issues there with the amount of, with these trade-offs between the payment level and the hectares entrusted to them. And let me now move, this is almost my last slide, to some of the results of these econometric estimates of the pre and post deliberation preferences. These results are willingness to accept estimates. That means euros per attribute that we need to pay for the farmers if we want them to enroll in one of these payment programs. The first thing I would like to say is that if we look at the performance criteria of our models, what we see is an improvement in the post-deliberation estimates. And this shows that the deliberation had a positive impact on the preferences in the sense of making them more accurate and more certain. So it has a positive impact on the accuracy of our estimates. And now if we move to the individual attributes, what we see for the advice attribute first is that it was significant in both the pre and the post deliberation, but with higher estimates in the post deliberation. And what we see there is this skepticism as that I mentioned before, that the farmers were not really concerned that the public administration would put in place a technician that would be on their side, that really would be an advisor and help them to develop their activity. And we know this is a major challenge for result-based payments for PAS schemes, because we need to enhance the collaboration and trust among the parties, and that will help us to experiment and to optimize and to test and try the way we develop these schemes. In the case of the bonus, you see that it was not significant in the post-deliberation, but it was, if you look at the lower part of the table, you see that the standard deviations are all significant for all the attributes and quite high. So we see this high heterogeneity in the bonus attribute as well, which for some of them clashes with their principal enterprise. It may compromise the welfare of their animals, and some of them were really against that. Then, in terms of the length, we see that this attribute became significant in the post-deliberation, and as I mentioned before, medium to long-term durations are preferred. And the option of counseling was very important for some of them, as the literature says that flexibility is key to enrolling. If we put them in a program or we ask them to join a program where they cannot step out when they want to, the likelihood of adoption can be very, very low. And finally, in terms of monitoring, we see that the monitoring attribute was not significant, but we see it has a high standard deviation. And we hypothesize this because this trade-offs that we mentioned before, that it may build confidence and reduce the crowding out, but it increases the amount of labor for them. So probably we need to increase the payments if we want the farmers to undertake the monitoring. And this takes me to my last slide on some take-home messages. First, targeted grazing could be, or it can be a valuable and still underutilized risk mitigation tool that can complement these mechanical tools and save some costs and help us to enlarge the area that we treat, that we actively manage. The feasibility of scaling these payments is linked also to adapting them to the local realities, as we saw in the adaptation of the scheme from Andalusia to Catalonia. And of course, for their continuation, there is some sustained public investment and planning required. Of course, there are areas where these PAS schemes can be challenging and, of course, require context-sensitive design, especially in high risk or abandoned or these mosaic areas. What we saw in our study is also that the farmers' preferences are diverse, and hence the flexibility in the design of these schemes is essential. And making the schemes adaptive and also transparent in the design can foster greater legitimacy and ultimately uptake. Finally, we see a challenge in standardizing these two attributes, which are monitoring and bonus payments, because we saw this high heterogeneity, and that needs co-design, experimentation, and trust building among the stakeholders to really streamline the design. And finally, we saw that deliberation in the design of these schemes can really support better policy design and ultimately adoption of the farmers. And with this, I finish the presentation. Thank you for being here today. And I'm really willing to get your comments and questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Elsa. Thanks a lot for your presentation. Very interesting. A lot of insights also from the Spanish studies and finally from this research. So, okay, take a breath and drink something if you need. I have a look at the chat and see if there is what there is for you. There is a question for Kelly. We come back later if we have time. And let's move to the question for you. Andrea says, in case of impact evaluation, there is some complexity regarding the attribution of causality, considering that targeted grazing treatment records may not be very precise in terms of the spatial extent and other important details. What is the protocol to build a robust record for spatial explicit impact evaluations?
Mm-hmm. A really good question. Thank you, Andrea. And I think something I always say when we talk about impact evaluation of targeted grazing is that because it's a new tool, we tend to look into, okay, we need how we're going to evaluate the impact of this. But that's something that we generally don't ask so frequently for mechanical means. So I would say in the cases that I just presented, since we're not using mechanical means in those cases, grazing is substituting mechanical means. What we can see is to address the impact evaluation, something that we did in Andalusia in a very rough way was looking into the avoided costs. If the farmers do their work, and we have, depending on the type of vegetation, if it's herbaceous vegetation, probably you don't, and they do their work in the way we want them to do it, and they consume almost all the vegetation with the animals, that means that we reduce a lot the necessity for having mechanical means. And then the impact, the avoided costs of that is very clear because we may not need mechanical means every second year, but every fifth year. So that's a clear way of assessing the impact, I would say. When we're looking into these infrastructures where we are substituting mechanical means with targeted grazing, if we are going to look into the impact on a broader scale, I would say that's more difficult, but that would be equated to what we do, for example, in the study of Kelly, looking into, okay, how the vegetation look and how this is reduced, and then trying to model the behavior of wildfires.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Alfred that moved attention from payment per hectare to payment per kilogram of wool or other output, for instance, manure of the herd. Would the system not become more sustainable and require less administrative control?
Per kilo of wool, but the service we're paying for is the reduction of biomass. So we're looking at that. So we need to, it is true that, I mean, there are many more things I could have presented today, but there is an interesting program that has been running in Catalonia, for example. And what they were trying to do is to improve the marketing of the products coming from these herds. So they created a label that was quite successful in some areas, and they created this alliance with local butchers. So you're selling the meat from these herds, not at a higher price, but you give them more publicity. You give them access to a broader market of consumers that may value and pay for this type of product. So that's another way of marketing maybe, but we are selling the service of wildfire risk mitigation. So we need to evaluate what's going on with the biomass. But of course, there's a way of labeling the products coming from these herds and maybe creating an extra source of income for these farmers. That's also we can maybe discuss at some point.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, this idea to combine the original payment with additional private market payment. I mean, in this case, is a markup to the value of the final product. Another question from Alfred is about how far can targeted grazing using this model be combined with rewilding by natural graziers?
that's a big topic. I don't want to open the Pandora box a lot, just a little bit. But I would say in the Mediterranean, we have, I mean, the thing with these herds and why extensive livestock farming is decreasing is because we need a shepherd. So we have a skilled person there that would take the animals to these areas and would make sure that they deliver the service in the area we need it. Of course, rewilding, having natural grazers, they can also consume biomass, but the consumption may not take place where you're interested in having it. We may need to rely on those as well because we're running out of extensive livestock farmers. And this can be maybe the future in combining them. But of course, extensive, I mean, farming and livestock farming can provide a more targeted, more to the point reduction of biomass in the areas where we need it. Apart from other benefits that we get of boosting local economies and promoting sustainable production of livestock products fed with natural resources, fed with within the landscapes.
Okay, thanks a lot. Many more other questions are coming, but we have time. Francisca asks, how is it expected that fuel management practices like grazing, even through payment for ecosystem services schemes, can be implemented in a scenario where the land registry is lacking and or a very fragmented landscape is present with many small private properties oftentimes abandoned?
It's a great question. I would say, I would see two things there. We know that in one of the areas where we run this study, which is Aragon, and they have a massive land abandonment. So shepherds now they don't have a problem in going and practice and taking their animals because actually there's literally no one saying that you cannot go into that land because that's been abandoned. We know that in some regions in Spain, we have some experiences of these communal forests that belong to, communal, semi-communal forests that belong to different owners, and some of them left. And as she says, we don't know where the owners are anymore. So we have developed legal ways of taking that land until we discover who the owner is and manage that actively. So yeah, we may need some legal reforms to say until we know who the owner is or claims the land, we take ownership in the sense of tendering, of actively managing the landscape because we are producing public goods or public bads in the sense of land that is more susceptible to suffer severe wildfires.
Thank you. A question from Anna is about this long-term sustainability of this payment.
So the payments, the two examples that I posed are funded by regional governments, but in the case of Andalusia, it is funded by the regional authorities, by the budget that they have allocated to wildfire management, and that was the secret, let's put it that way, of this long-term maintenance of the payment because it did not depend on for example, on European subsidies or on the common agricultural policy as the case of Catalonia, because you have the funding periods and then the money that you allocate to sustainable forest management in the case of Catalonia can vary, so you're never sure. This has, as always, I think the commitment of high-level politicians was key in Andalusia to keep the program going, and then it would be very unpopular to put it away, but it's not going through its best moments because it needs adaptability. As you saw, the payments are very low and haven't been updated. So I think there's an issue of political will to keep these programs going, to enlarge them, because of course we allocate a lot of money to suppression and it's very it's easy to sell to the society, but this type of initiatives are popular and people like them, but we know that politically the allocation of funds to wildfire risk mitigation is lower.
I think we have one additional questions, which is about, based on your experience with grazing approaches, which livestock type, cattle, goats, sheep, would you recommend as most effective for reducing fuel loads?
I would say a combination of them all, because we know that they have different behaviors. So I would say our Mediterranean rangelands are very goat oriented because you have shrubby vegetation. So for shrubby vegetation, typically goats do better. But then for more herbaceous vegetation, sheep typically do better. And then cattle, because they're heavier, they can really trample and have a bigger effect trampling. So it depends also on the breeds, because there are very rustic breeds that are used to eat whatever is there, really things that look very harsh and they eat them happily. You would be amazed with traditional breeds how they're able to consume vegetation. So I would say it depends on the vegetation and ideally having a combination. And of course, we need to remember that the more we graze it, the better the pasture will become. So we need to look at time frames that are why to improve the quality of the pasture by grazing, because animal grazing improves the quality of the vegetation.
Perfect. I think we have time for one question before kicking off in the next minutes for concluding, sorry. The questions from Florian is not in the chat, it's in the other chat, and Florian asks, I can tell you, is there a cost-benefit assessment that we could use in more regional studies, for instance, at the European level? And is there a thumb rule figure of cost per hectare and avoided damage? So I think probably the question is about doing a kind of benefit transfer to other regional case studies, eventually in Europe, from your experience, maybe the Mediterranean to other areas.
Not that I'm aware of. What we did and we published something very little in one of the Wildfire Congress many years ago, and it was more on the avoided costs of grazing in the RAPCA program, because we knew, and I mean, if you send me an email, I can send you that. It's in Spanish, but I guess it's easy to translate. I don't know, with ChatGPT or whatever, you just upload it there. So what we did there was looking into the mechanical cost of mechanical clearing in some of the field breaks in the province of Malaga, where the program was starting to develop. And what we considered was, the payment that we were giving to the farmers and the cost of the mechanical machinery. And then we were having a look at the avoided costs, because the mechanical vegetation reduction was delayed because of the grazing. So we were looking at that, and depending on the areas, because some areas are quite expensive to clear mechanically, because you have a lot of shrubbery sprout and it's very harsh with a high slope. So in those areas, it was performing way better than mechanical clearing and saving up to 60% of the costs. But you have also to remember that the payments are quite low in Andalusia, and that's another issue, why farmers get involved in a place where, in a program where payments are quite low. And there we discovered that in some cases it was not just a financial reason that was playing, that was operating for them to participate.
Thanks a lot, Elsa. I think it's 7 minutes to go. I'm glad now to move to the final session. Let's say we have nearly the final 5-6 minutes, and I hand over to Domingos, who may have some additional ideas to introduce before we conclude.
Thank you very much, Simone. Before I speak, I remember that you mentioned before that there was a question also to Kelly, and I don't know if Kelly also wants to comment something about Elsa's presentation. Okay.
Yes, if you want, there is a last questions that came when Elsa was speaking, and this is for Kelly. And the question from Elena is, did the study include private forest land? If yes, were the treatments similarly designed and paid to land managers?
No, in this context, the source water collection system is mostly public lands, and that's where the fuel treatments were targeted. So it's certainly a very different case than what Elsa presented, where you're making direct payments to private landowners and understanding that heterogeneity of preferences for the private landowners. In this case, it's actually getting implemented on public lands, and so you have one main landowner, land manager, a little bit simpler in terms of that negotiation. So in a lot of our lands in the Western US, a lot of our source fire protection forests are public lands. And so we're not doing a lot of direct payments for private landowners. There are a lot of cost share programs, though, to work with private landowners to do fuel treatment mitigation around their homes, but not as much from like a water utility paying private landowners to do that type of work. So different context. And I'll just say Elsa's presentation, that was really interesting. I'm definitely curious now to see if there are similar programs going on in the Western United States using grazers. But yeah, all the questions that came to my mind were asked by the participants. So yeah, it was great to learn a little bit about that mechanism for fuel treatment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kelly, for your additional comments. Domingos?
Thank you. I'd like to thank both of you for your great presentations. We learn very much, a lot from these webinars, and we can see that even this very simple but very important issue of biomass reduction that is a key to reduce the risk of wildfires. It has lots of things to do, and to the payment of ecosystem services. Also, we need to study and to learn quite a lot. You brought very interesting examples from different parts of the world with different backgrounds, but with the same objective. And for us, of course, we are closer to this case of Spain, and Elsa presented two examples in two regions of Spain. But we know that in Portugal there are also similar efforts, and I believe in other regions of Spain, like Galicia and other parts. It would be interesting, let's say, to compare how let's say, how general these ideas and these problems are, because of course it's a great solution, but it has many difficulties, as you have seen, with the people that is required, that the shepherds, and of course the animals that are the object of the activities. And this is something that we need to know more and better to encourage as a source of biomass reduction. In Portugal and more or less in Europe, we very often hear about people defending the use of these cattle to reduce the biomass, but it's not an easy problem. Okay, from my side, I thank you again for your work, for your preparation, and for the presentations that brought us all this learning. Those of you that are asking for the presentations, I remind that the video of the webinar will be made public in the YouTube in a couple of days. And those of you that need any certificate of attending the webinar, we can also provide. If you ask us, we can provide to you. And once again, my thanks to Simone for having put this webinar together, to Kelly and to Elsa for your presentations, and for all of you that who attended. This is a great opportunity for us as well. Goodbye for all of you. Bye.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.